Our readings following the lectionary readings in 1 and 2 Samuel bring us this morning to this incredible lament at the beginning of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. It's a lament for the death of Saul and his son Jonathan, a lament sung, written, intoned by David. If we've been following the lectionary in recent weeks, we've seen the young David chosen and anointed. We've seen him rejected by Saul as a challenge to his authority. Remember last week, the women singing that Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul's jealousy over David has consumed him. And we now skip forward possibly several years to this moment in time where Saul and Jonathan, his son, lie dead upon the battlefield. And David reacts to the news of this death, the death of his enemy, I guess, and of his beloved, Saul and Jonathan. For David has effectively been fighting a reluctant insurgency. He's been driven out from the king's presence. He has been biding his time. In one extraordinary passage, we even discover that David and his war band have been fighting on the side of the Philistines against other enemies. But David has desperately tried not to engage Saul in battle. He's even had opportunity to kill King Saul, a famous passage where David is hidden in a cave and Saul comes in to relieve himself. And David could have seized the crown, seized the throne at that moment, but he will not do that. And so we come to a point where Saul has been killed by others. And we have David's response. And I want to argue that the language of lament in this passage, verses 17 to 27 of 2 Samuel chapter 1, do read them. This language of lament it's in no way the polite political language on the death of a rival. I remembered many years ago, do you remember the old TV series, Not the 9 O'Clock News, political satire at its best? Mel Smith and Rowan Atkinson are arguing with one another on a TV chat show, and they are verbally tearing one another to pieces as they doubt each other's fitness to be a politician, as they query their wisdom and their standing. And partway through this incredible political argument, Rowan Atkinson's character drops dead. And mid-sentence, Mel Smith changes from his invective over the uselessness of this political rival to language of praise for this man who will be sorely missed, whose like will not be seen again. He changes mid-sentence to the appropriate political politeness on the loss of a rival. Well, we've seen such things in our time too. But I want to argue that this passage is totally different to that. This is not simply David writing about Saul in polite terms because that's what you did. There is something heartfelt, something extraordinary about his commitment to his previous rival. There is a heartfelt love. Did you note the 3 times repeated refrain? How the mighty have fallen. This is a lament that David writes for the people to remember the death of Saul and to remember the death of so many in battle. We're told that this is written down and and kept to be sung. I wonder whether it was used in the ancient Israelite equivalent of Remembrance Sunday commemorations. I wonder whether it was used when people gathered to remember the fallen. How the mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen. 3 times we hear David's impassioned lament. David mourns the loss of Saul. But David also mourns the loss of Jonathan. And if anything, the language is even more heartfelt, even more impassioned. Jonathan is described by David as my brother. Not just politeness, but a real reflection on how Jonathan and David were together in the presence of Saul's palace, where David is almost welcomed into the family as a brother for Jonathan at one stage. But he goes beyond that adopted filial language. He describes him as greatly loved. And then in an extraordinary sentence, he says, your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. Well, this passage has been used at times to argue that Jonathan and David were far from being simply brothers in that palace, but were lovers in the palace. And I'm not sure that that's the only way that this passage could be read. I don't think this passage requires you to believe that Jonathan and David had some sort of romantic, passionate relationship in that way. But it certainly doesn't rule it out. This is amazing language of love and commitment. It's been a difficult relationship between Jonathan and David, where effectively Jonathan has had to choose between his father and his brother, his father and his lover. Jonathan has had to stay with Saul and see David driven out. This must have been so difficult for Jonathan, so difficult for David. But there is no hint of bitterness or regret in David's lament. David simply pours out his love for Jonathan. I realize this is a controversial area, not least as people talk about biblical understandings of marriage. I guess I could be naughty and comment that in passing, David was subject to all manner of biblical understandings of marriage. David was effectively married off several times for the political expediency of his nation. He had been promised in marriage to one of Saul's daughters, but somehow that did not come about. There was all sorts of links that were about marriage as a political expediency rather than anything to do with romance and love. And yet that's biblical marriage. Or then there is the marriage that David himself enters into with Bathsheba, an extraordinary thing that will happen further on in the story where King now, David, sees Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop across from the palace. And not only does he exploit his power to make her his own in what is close to being, if not obviously being, an abuse of power and an abusive relationship. David makes Bathsheba his wife by having her husband killed off. This, apparently, is biblical marriage. I wonder if David perhaps would have preferred a different sort of relationship, one that was not permitted to him in his day, and one that is still not permitted for so many in so many of our churches. I wonder. It's not the only way you can read this passage. It's not the only thing to take from this passage. But at the very least, there is a question that should rumble around our minds when we hear David write of the love of his life who lies dead on the battlefield. My brother, greatly loved. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. I wonder. This passage, I think, gives us at least two challenges for our living as Christians and as a church in the days and months ahead. And the first is to note that this is a lament. Something dreadful has happened, and David laments it. He writes down his sadness and has it sung by the people. I think occasionally I meet people who think that coming to church is about singing jolly songs, whatever is going on. And jolly songs do not always cut it. There is a time and there is a place within the life of our church and all churches for noticing that life hurts. Stuff happens. Love is lost. There is a time and a place for lament within our church life too. And do you know what? It might be at the moment. Over the last 15 months, we have lost so much. We have physically lost people. Loved ones have died, and we have not been able to mourn in the usual way. We have lost the opportunity to meet together in the normal way. We have grown accustomed to Zoom and telephone calls, but it's not the same. It's not the same as seeing our grandchildren. It's not the same as a visit from a beloved friend. I think we need to recover and rediscover the place of lament within church life, to declare that not everything is good all of the time, that some of it truly stinks, and to cry out to God in the reality of that, to declare in God's presence that we hurt and we have lost. I think there is a need to recover lament. And I believe there is a need to recover a sense of passionate love, a love for one another, a love that will not be broken. Or rather, there is a need to recognize that such love, where it exists, needs to be cherished, needs to be supported. I don't think it's an accident that the traditional Christian marriage service ends with those words about what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. I don't think that's an accident of history. I think there is something about saying that where love exists, those around us should learn to cherish it too, to support it, to encourage it. Marriage can be difficult in our culture, as all too public announcements in recent days have illustrated. What is our place in supporting and enabling and encouraging love to flourish? Where love already exists, how do we nurture it? Where love has been lost, how do we lament it? And where love is yet to be, how do we create it? How do we enable those still searching for love to know that they are searching not in vain hope, but in the context of a God who has so loved this world, so lavished his love upon this world, that he sent his Son? Well, will we recover that understanding of our faith that says love is at the center of everything, that love wins? Will we learn to celebrate love in all its many-colored splendor? Will we learn to celebrate love without boundaries and exclusions? Will we learn to celebrate love? David had lost those who were dearest to him, and he lamented. David needed to understand that love was lost, but not forever. I don't know that anyone could have comforted David in that day. But I think it's important that as David began his time as king in Israel, he did so not by glorying in the defeat of an enemy, but in lamenting the loss of those he loved, fallen in battle. May we learn more of love and lament in our lives too. Amen.